Good evening. It's been such an encouraging weekend so far. It's good to have another one of my old friends here tonight, Jonathan Wilson and his wife Tabitha and their children. So when I grew up as a child, we worshiped the same congregation together in North Florida. So good to see people who you knew from the past that are still faithful to the Lord as many fall by the wayside. Tonight, the lesson we're going to study may have a lot of elements that are familiar to some of the children here, because tonight we're going to be looking at 9 macroevolution myths that are still taught in public schools today. The case for macroevolution is so weak that its proponents are forced to use disproven examples to try to make their point. So here are the 9 frauds we're going to look at. We'll discuss them one by one. And really, you notice at the bottom of this chart here, what we're really going to address with almost everyone is that macroevolution requires new genes, mutations, new genetic information, which they cannot prove. Now, not just creationists, but evolutionists even admit that there is deceit out there amongst evolutionists. Here's an evolutionist, Dr. Pierre-Paul Grosset. He was the past president of the French Academy of Sciences. This whole quote deals with evolution, but I'm just going to read the last excerpt. He said, "The deceit is sometimes unconscious, but not always, since some people, owing to their sectarianism, purposely overlook reality and refuse to acknowledge the inadequacies and falsity of their beliefs." Now, as Christians, we must be different. As the Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4:2, "But we have renounced the hidden things of shame, not walking in craftiness, nor handling the word of God deceitfully, but by manifestation of the truth, commending ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God." Now, these frauds aren't anything new. They've been going back over 130 years. In fact, probably, maybe the most famous fraud of all time was the Piltdown Man hoax in 1912. And to set the stage for this hoax, understand that Charles Darwin's second book that he wrote in 1871, The Descent of Man, said we evolved from apes. Now, your teachers might dispute that today, but that's what Charles Darwin said. We evolved from apes. Well, for the next 50 years, primarily the clergy in different denominations challenged the evolutionists and said, if we evolved from apes, then why can't you show us in the fossils? And if they couldn't find one, they were going to invent one. So in 1912, an amateur fossil hunter named Charles Dawson said he discovered this jawbone and pieces of a skull in an abandoned quarry in Piltdown, England. They took it to Cambridge, had it examined, and they declared Piltdown Man, our ancestor. They immediately took the jawbone and the skull, made plaster casts of it, and locked the original artifacts away in a safe for over 40 years. They took the plaster cast, put it in the museum in London, and for the next over 40 years, hundreds of thousands of people were told this was their ancestor, whom they evolved from. People went to their grave thinking this was their ancestor. Well, in the mid to early 1950s, they opened the safe and examined the original artifacts. And immediately at looking at them, they knew that this was a jawbone of an orangutan and pieces of a skull of a human. It was all a fake. In fact, they could see that they had been stained to make them look older. The orangutan teeth had been filed down to make them look like human teeth. And with the naked eye, they could even see the etch marks where the teeth had been filed down. This became known as the Great Piltdown Hoax here in Reader's Digest in 1956. But there are many examples prior to that. In 1922, they said we evolved from Nebraska man until they found that was just a tooth of a pig. That's a picture of Nebraska man that they drew from this one single pig tooth. In 1892, they say we evolved from Orsay man until they found that it was only the skull of a donkey. In 1891, they said we evolved from Java man till they found it was only the skull, cap, teeth, and femur of a human. And then another hoax we've already talked about is that life arose from non-life, as is taught in schools, is a hoax. Well, should we be surprised? No. The Bible tells us there will be deceivers who peddle lies to replace divine truth with their error. As the Apostle Paul said in Colossians 2 and verse 8, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. So let's get into the 9 frauds. The first one is animal homology. And this teaching says because there are similar features in different animals, they must have all evolved from one another. And the common example that's used is the forelimb of different animals. Here you have the forelimb of man, dog, whale, etc. Now you do see some similarities, don't you? But what does that prove? It could be a common ancestor that they evolved from, but it also could be a common designer that used the same design in different animals. For instance, here's the 1953 to 1984 Corvette. You see similarities, don't you? They're all different, but you see similarities. That doesn't mean they evolved from one another. They had a common designer, which we know as General Motors, that created them and used similar design in the different cars. Well, what would discredit the Darwinian evolutionary model of homology? Here is one idea that definitely would discredit it. If you had identical structures in animals that appeared in different evolutionary lines. In other words, animals that did not evolve from one another, but they had the same feature. That would show that it was a creator, an intelligent designer. We see that in the vertebrates and the mollusks. Now, the mollusk was supposed to have divided off from the vertebrae line hundreds of millions of years before. And yet they have the same organ. The same organ. Their eye is very similar. Now, evolutionists say, well, this is just convergent evolution. They try to dismiss it. What is convergent evolution? Well, it's hard to believe that an eyeball could evolve. It's impossible to believe it can evolve in one animal. But they say the exact same structure accidentally evolved in 2 different animals. Notice here is the human eye and the octopus eye. Both have an eyelid, cornea, pupil, iris, ciliary muscle, lens, retina, and optic nerve or optic ganglion. One is at the bottom of the ocean and one is walking around on the moon. Who can believe that they both evolved the same structure? Furthermore, if similarities indicate that they evolved from the same animal, what should we find that proves that they were coded the same or blueprinted? Well, of course, the genes in the DNA. You should find the same genes, homologous genes or blueprints in those animals. Do we find them? No. I want to show you a quote here. Before I read this quote, and he talks about genes in 1971, Dr. Gavin DeBeer, he refers back to genes in 1938. Someone confronted me after the lesson and said, that quote doesn't make sense. We didn't know about DNA in 1938. He's not talking about DNA, he's talking about genes, genetics. We knew about genes since the creationist Gregor Mendel, as we said last night, published his paper in 1866. We knew that genes control heredity. Well, this is what Dr. DeBeer says. What mechanism can it be that results in production of homologous organs, the same patterns, in spite of their not being controlled by the same genes? I asked this question in 1938, and it has not been answered here in 1971, and has not been answered today. How can you have the same organs, but different genes control them? You know what the answer is? A common designer. God used the same organ in different animals and just put different genetic codes in each. So the point one take-home message is similarities in different animals suggest a common designer and not a common ancestor. Point number two is embryology. This is another one that's commonly used in school. The story goes that as an embryo develops, it recapitulates evolution. In other words, at one point in time, we all evolved from a tadpole, they said. So, when the embryo develops, all embryos look like a tadpole at some point. This is actually a college textbook, and this is just a flat lie here. They call these different folds in the skin of the neck, these pharyngeal folds, they call them gill slits. Gill slits. There's nothing about this that's similar to a gill. It's just a made-up story. So here is how the idea of embryology became popularized. A scientist in Germany, he was known as the German apostle of Darwinism, Ernst Haeckel. After Darwin's book was published in 1859, almost no one was believing it. Many people believe it today, but back then it was like 1% or less of people believed it. Well, he had to convince the German people that evolution occurred. So he made up a series of wood carvings and showed that in the stage one of the embryo, they all look the same, don't they? They all look like a tadpole. But in stage 3, of course, they all look different. The fish, hog, human, etc. Well, the problem was that what you're seeing are the original wood carving prints from Haeckel's embryos. These are the originals. Do you want to see what the actual embryos look like? These are the actual embryos that correspond to the different animals. Look at the salamander. Is that even close? No, it's totally different. Turns out it was a fraud, but don't take it from me. Let's listen to the evolutionists. Dr. Stephen Gould from Harvard said Haeckel exaggerated the similarities in a procedure that can only be called fraudulent. We do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks. In fact, in the year 2000, another team examined these. Dr. Michael Richardson and a team of international experts out of the Netherlands examined this. And when they were done examining to see if there was any validity to Haeckel's embryos, this is what they wrote in the journal Science. It looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology. Then why do they still teach it in schools? Because they don't have anything better. Point 2 take-home message, Darwinists even admit that Haeckel's embryos are frauds. Embryology proves nothing about our origins. Point 3 is the English peppered moth. This is very commonly used in textbooks. And let's just remind you of the mechanisms that they say drives evolution. They say evolution is created by two things: random mutations, that's errors in the genetic code, which creates mutant species. The mutant species outcompete the wild type animals and leave more offspring. So you have to have mutations, changes in the DNA. Well, here's how the story went. In England, you have the peppered moth, and there was two variants. There was a light-colored moth that you see here, and then there was a dark-colored moth. They were the same, but the dark-colored moth just had more melanin, more pigment. So a scientist, an English scientist named Bernard Kettlewell, came up with a story. He invented this story because at this time, the light-colored moths were disappearing, and there were more dark-colored moths. So he said because of the Industrial Revolution that emitted great amounts of coal soot, the trees were covered in this soot, and the light-colored lichen died. And he said there are more dark moths because now the dark moths could camouflage themselves against the dark-colored tree, and the birds would eat all the light-colored moths. Well, what did that prove? That only proved there's variation within a kind. That some of the moths had more melanin than others. Some of us have more melanin in our skin than others. The fact is there's no new genetic information. There's no mutations. It's just a story. So here's what you should ask your teacher about the peppered moth supposed evolution. Ask them if the peppered moth demonstrates macroevolution, what new genes have been added to the moth genome? The answer is none. But don't take it from me. A very staunch evolutionist from the University of Chicago, Jerry Coyne, said this about the peppered moth. These examples represent the loss of traits rather than the origin of evolutionary novelties. In other words, they're losing melanin, they're losing pigment, they're not gaining anything. He's saying they're not evolving, they're devolving. This is devolution. Now, if you look at the whole story, there are multiple problems with the peppered moth story. A number of them are up here. I'm just going to point out the last one. One of the most egregious problems with Kettlewell's study was that the photographs were staged. Signed eyewitness testimony says he used cage-bred moths. Some of them were so lethargic they had to be warmed up on the hood of the car. And he also took moths and glued and pinned them to the sides of trees in order to make his films about birds eating the moths off the side of trees, and he would wait for hours for birds to come eat the moths off the side of the trees. The fact is, they came to find out that the moths never rested on side of the trees in the first place. It was a hoax. These moths rested and slept in the high parts of the trees on the underside of branches, where birds typically do not hunt. Now, even though your taxpayer dollars are still going to be used to teach children this in Tennessee on Monday morning, 50 years ago, we knew this was wrong. 54 years ago, Dr. L. Harrison Matthews was honored to write the foreword to Darwin's Origin of Species in 1971, and he wrote this: "The peppered moth experiments show survival of the fittest, but they do not show evolution in progress." Then why is the peppered moth still used in evolutionary textbooks in Tennessee in 2025? Because they don't have anything better to teach students about how evolution occurred. In fact, notice this. This is a curriculum developed by the National Science Teachers Association about evolution. And regarding the pepper moth, have students read Evolution's Link to Development Explored. Also, your tax dollars hard at work. This is an exhibit in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And they say this: there are many examples of evolution in action, but this one, the peppered moth, is often referred to because it has been so well documented. Well, the problem is, notice here they say mutations introduce new characteristics. There are no mutations. They're saying because some moths have more melanin, more pigment in the skin, in the wings, then they must be mutated. That's false. That's wrong. There's no mutations. Now, I said that some of us have more melanin in our skin than others. That would be like saying dark-skinned people are mutated because they have more melanin in their skin. Try that in public schools and see how it flies. Point 3 take-home message: the peppered moth demonstrates microevolution and not macroevolution. Point 4 is alleged horse evolution. When I was at the University of Georgia years ago, I had a friend. She was actually a believer, but she believed in evolution. She was a technician in our lab. And I just asked her one day, okay, what do you think is the strongest argument for evolution? And without missing a beat, she said, well, of course, the horse evolution that we see in the textbooks, the little horses evolving to the big horses. We all know that occurred, right? Well, this is actually one of the most easy to disprove. The problem here is that all these horses, except for Eohippus, the dawn horse or Hyracotherium, all the other horses, evolutionists say, lived at the same time. In fact, in some sediment, the larger horses are buried lower than the smaller horses. If they lived at the same time, they did not evolve from one another. Now that should be good enough, but 32 years ago, even though it's going to be taught in Tennessee schools, public schools, Monday morning, 32 years ago, Doctors Gould and Eldridge from Ivy League universities said, throughout the history of horses, the species are well marked and static over millions of years. The gradualistic picture of horse evolution becomes a bush of overlapping, closely related species. They're saying they did not evolve from one another. Now, that should be good enough, but there's more. Let's go back further. 39 years ago, Dr. Stephen Stanley from Johns Hopkins said the horse is the classic story of one genus turning into another, turning into another. Now it's becoming apparent that there's an overlap of these genera. There isn't just a simple gradual transition from one horse to another. But you know, you can even go back further. You can go back 71 years. Dr. N.H. Nilsson, a Swedish geneticist from the University of Lund, said this: the family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in the textbooks. The construction of the horse is therefore a very artificial one and cannot therefore be a continuous transformation series. They did not evolve from one another. But we can go back further. Dr. George Gaylord Simpson from Columbia University, he's actually one of the architects that in the 30s and 40s came up with the neo-Darwinism. This is what he said: the uniform continuous transformation of Hyracotherium, that's the little dawn horse, into Equus, that's the big horse, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. Now, if we knew this 72 years ago, why is it still going to be taught in Tennessee public schools Monday? You know the answer: because they don't have anything better. Point 4, take-home message: horse evolution never occurred. Next is Darwin's finches. This is another very common one that's used. So as the story goes, we mentioned Friday night or Thursday night that Darwin in 1831 went around the world on a 2-year voyage in the HMS Beagle as the ship's naturalist. Now, when they went around South America, they came up to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, which are a series of about 15 different islands. On these islands, Darwin discovered 9 different species of finches. And his conclusion was, this proves evolution, because all of these finches must have evolved from the common mainland finch. Now, what were the difference in these finches? The biggest difference was in the size of the beaks. Well, what does this prove, that there's different size beaks? It only proves that there's variation within a kind, which we'll talk about tomorrow morning. Variation within a kind. They're not evolving into anything else. In fact, I would argue that there are fewer differences in Darwin's finches, which they say are different species, than in the 360 breeds of dogs that are all the same species. These 2 dogs, they say, are the same species, and they're not evolving into anything else. We'll talk more in the morning about this, but suffice it to say that these dogs are actually mutants. They are devolving. They're going down. So what's really happening here? No new genetic information is added to improve the finches, to improve these animals. So this is what you should ask your teacher about Darwin's finches when you're taught this in school. If Darwin's finches demonstrate macroevolution, then what new genes have been added to the finch genome? The answer, none. None. So they actually contradict themselves when they say mutations and new genes are required for evolution, and then they give you examples that have no new genes and no mutations. Again, why is it going to be taught in schools Monday? Because they have no better examples. So the point 5 take-home message, Darwin's finches demonstrate microevolution, variation within a kind, and not macroevolution, microbe to man. Next, let's look at the Neanderthals. Were Neanderthals an unevolved ape-like creature, or were they humans? Now, they do say we didn't evolve from them. They were a separate line, but they still use them to show evolution. Well, what were the major differences between Neanderthals and humans? The major differences consisted of the fact that they had thicker bones, thicker skulls, more protruding ridge brows, and they actually had a larger, on average, do you take the average human, the Neanderthals had a larger cranial capacity, they had larger brains. In fact, they may have been smarter than us, as you will see in a minute. I'm going to argue that Neanderthals were simply humans. Here are some clues that Neanderthal was human. Neanderthal people are known to have created and hunted with weapons, created artwork, set broken bones, created musical instruments, made tools and jewelry, built and rode in ocean-sailing vessels, observed religious practices, buried their dead with honors. They spoke an intelligible language. They cultivated and used pigment. They cooked their food, even vegetables, which is supposed to be a very high level of intelligence. And here is a very significant fact. Since the 1950s, the evolutionists have even admitted that Neanderthals' anatomy falls within the range of humans today. That is, on average, their brains were bigger, but there are humans today that have the same cranial capacity as Neanderthals. And here's an even more powerful point. In recent years, based on genetic studies and DNA that we've extracted from Neanderthal bones, they know that they lived at the same time as humans, they walked like humans, they acted like humans, and they even interbred with humans. Last year, I was up at Michigan State University, and I was talking to some of the students on a project, and somehow they started talking about 23andMe and talking about their ancestry and where they were from. And this girl said, "Did you know that it popped up on my ancestry that I have 1% Neanderthal genes?" And I said, of course, they were humans. Many people have Neanderthal genes. Why? Because they were simply humans. And yet they are depicted in kind of an unevolved state in the museums with these protruding ridge brows. Well, you know, there are humans today and in the past that had protruding ridge brows. Can you think of anyone with large ridge brows? How about Charles Darwin? He had protruding ridge brows. Maybe he was Neanderthal. I don't know. But some of the tribes around the world have the same cranial capacity and the same protruding ridge brows as Neanderthals. So point 6 take-home message, Neanderthals were humans. Well, there is an example that they say was our ancestor. And the most common one that's used is Lucy, also known as Australopithecus afarensis. This is a picture of Lucy in a museum. It was discovered in Africa in the late 70s. The bones were, and you see the bones here with Donald Johanson, who discovered them. And they said, we evolved from Lucy. Now, why did they think we evolved from Lucy? The main thing they say is because she stood upright. She walked upright. This is taught in all schools. This is the most common example of our ancestor that's used. It's even taught to little children. Here's a lesson plan for teaching children about evolution. Early humans for kids. The first humans, hominids, are the family of mankind, they say. And notice this. How do scientists know about an early man who lived 3 million years ago? Lucy told them. Well, there are numerous problems with this. We could go on for half an hour about the problems with Lucy. I'll just point out some of the most significant problems. First of all, the same rock layer that Lucy was found in was supposed to be before humans evolved, and yet in 1976, Mary Leakey found these human footprints in the same rock layer. What does that tell you? Humans and Lucy lived at the same time. We did not evolve from Lucy. But notice what PBS said. PBS said the footprints, these are the Laetoli footprints in Africa, they were in the same rock layer as Lucy. The footprints also look remarkably like humans. In fact, they looked so human-like, some scientists had a hard time believing that they were made by Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy's species, the only human ancestor known to have lived at the time. Well, I'm sorry, these are human footprints. Do you want to see what Lucy's footprints look like? Here, on the left are the Laetoli footprints. On the right, this is a human footprint. That is what Lucy's footprint would have looked like. Totally different. In fact, in the Journal of Physical Anthropology, they wrote that these footprints were indistinguishable from those of habitually barefoot Homo sapiens. But did you know human footprints found in rocks that are supposed to be millions of years old, long before we were supposed to evolve? Human footprints have been found in these rocks all over the world. Here's some of them. They've been found in Africa, in Texas, in New Mexico, in Hawaii, in Turkey, in Italy, in France. There's others in the former Soviet Union and some of those countries. In the journal Science, they wrote the uneroded footprints show a total morphological pattern like seen in modern humans. In the prestigious journal Nature, now notice the main evidence that Lucy is our ancestor is that she walked upright. The problem is many scientists say she didn't. Now this was back in 2000 in Nature. They wrote, new evidence has come forth that Lucy has the morphology of a knuckle walker. She did not walk upright. Here's a more recent article that says Lucy's development was ape-like. They also say that her development followed the trajectory of African apes more than humans. The conclusion is consistent with the evidence that Lucy's development was ape-like. She was not developing into a human. She was an ape. And as I've understood, and there's many of your teachers that teach this is your ancestor, you can find many, even evolutionists, that will refute that and say this is a fraud. Many people believe that she's almost identical to a pygmy chimp today, a pygmy chimp. So the point 7 take-home message, evolutionists even admit Lucy is not our ancestor. Point 8 is fruit fly evolution. fruit fly evolution. So remember, what does evolution require? Mutations, and then the mutated species will outcompete and leave more offspring. So when I was in 7th grade, they had us use mutagenic chemicals to mutate these poor flies, and we changed all types of features. We changed, by the mutation, we changed their eyes, their antennae, their legs, their thorax, their abdomen, and their wing. Now the favorite mutation that everyone tries to achieve is actually 2 mutations that come together, and it creates a 4-winged fruit fly. And in school, they show you this picture and they say, see, that's evolution, a 4-winged fruit fly. Well, I want to introduce you to a principle I like to call it the PBS principle. That's easy to remember because they teach evolution on PBS, which incidentally, your taxpayer dollars fund. So the PBS principle is this: in order for evolution to be true, it has to meet 3 criteria. Number 1, P, it has to be persistent. That is, the mutation has to be passed on to the next generation. Number 2, B, it has to be beneficial. It has to help the animal outcompete the other animals in the wild. And number 3, S, it has to be structural. It can't be like your teachers will tell you, just antibiotic resistance in bacteria or pesticide resistance in insects. It has to be a structural, featural change. Otherwise, how are you going to turn a mosquito into a rhinoceros? Translation, favorable structural changes must be passed down to the progeny. Well, let's try this on the 4-winged fruit fly that they're going to tell you in school. P, are these mutations persistent? Are they passed down to the next generation? No. Do you know why? Because the 4-winged fruit fly cannot breed. B, is it beneficial? Does it help the fruit fly in the wild? No, because the 4-winged fruit fly cannot even fly. S, is it structural? Yes, it's structural. But if it can't be passed down to the next generation or benefited in the wild, then it is dead. So this is what you should ask your teacher about fruit fly evolution. If fruit fly mutations demonstrate macroevolution, what new beneficial genes have been added to the fruit fly genome? And why is it going to be taught in your public schools Monday? Because they don't have any better examples. Point 8, take-home message: fruit fly mutations demonstrate microevolution, variation within a kind, and not microbe to man, macroevolution. The last point tonight, and this is again extremely common when I was taught it all the way through school, even into college. A lot of people in society cite this example a lot. Vestigial organs. What are vestigial organs? They say vestigial organs are the vestiges or the remnants of organs we used to use in the past, but they've been slowly disappearing because we don't need those organs anymore. In fact, in 1931, a German scientist, Dr. Alfred Wiedersheim, in a book entitled The Science of Life, listed 180, quote, useless vestigial organs in the body alone. Did you know since 1931 we've shown that every single one of these 180 useless organs are useful in our body. In fact, 2 creation scientists, Drs. Bergman and Howe, wrote this book, Vestigial Organs Are Fully Functional. But you know, even though it's still taught in schools, we've known this for decades, that vestigial organs do not prove evolution. In fact, 44 years ago, 1981, the year I started first grade, Dr. S.R. Scatting in the journal Evolutionary Theory said this: vestigial organs provide no evidence for evolutionary theory. The interesting thing, the Encyclopedia Britannica must have not gotten the message, because 16 years later they said this: The appendix does not serve any useful purpose as a digestive organ in humans, and it is believed to be gradually disappearing in the human species over evolutionary time. However, we can go back to 1992. In the book Clinically Oriented Anatomy, Dr. Keith Moore describes the appendix as a well-developed lymphoid organ. It's useful in developing immunity. In fact, 48 years ago, in the journal Gastroenterology, they wrote, the appendix is not generally credited with significant function. However, current evidence tends to involve it in the immunologic mechanism. In fact, the latest I've heard, it seems that they've demonstrated that the appendix is useful to infants because it serves as a storehouse for bacteria to help develop immunity in the infant. It also helps in cases of severe dysentery, when your whole GI tract is flushed out with fluids, and it saves some of that bacteria to build your system back up. The next one is the tonsils. Oftentimes we're told the tonsils are not useful. We don't need them for anything. They serve no purpose. Well, notice in 2008, I pulled this off years ago. Notice what even left-leaning Wikipedia has to say. Like other organs of the lymphatic system, the tonsils are part of your lymph system. The tonsils act as part of the immune system to help protect against infection. In particular, they are believed to be involved in helping fight off pharyngeal and upper respiratory tract infections. Well, that pretty much does away with that, doesn't it? Next is the coccyx. I can remember being taught this in school. The coccyx, or the tailbone in humans. Now, what they taught me in school is the coccyx, we don't need it. The coccyx, or the tailbone, is there because we evolved from monkeys or monkey-like creatures that swung around in the trees with these long tails. And over time, we lost those tails, but we still had the tailbone. That's what we're taught. I actually threw this up. This is from a Chick track on evolution. And this professor says vestigial organs like the human tailbone prove that we evolved from animals with tails. The college student says, sir, there are 9 muscles that attach to the tailbone. It is not vestigial. The fact is that those 9 muscles hold up the pelvic girdle and keep your insides from falling down. It's very useful. Next is another one that I was taught, the wings of flightless birds, such as the ostrich, emu, and rhea. We were taught in school that these birds can't fly because they used to fly, but as they evolved, they lost the use of their wings. And so now their wings are not needed. Well, they're actually very useful to the birds in numerous ways. First of all, the mother bird uses it. The hen uses it to protect the chicks. It's used in balance and running. Maybe most importantly, it's used for balance when they're breeding. And as some of the poultry farmers here can tell you, I've known from my experience that what do the broilers do when they get hot? They sit down and open up their wings. It's an excellent radiator for heat in hot weather. The wings are useful. Next, supposed hip bones in whales. So the evolutionary story goes like this. And if it wasn't so ridiculous and devious, it would be funny. But they say that these oceanic creatures evolved out of the ocean into cow-like creatures and started walking on land. But later, the cow-like creatures walked back into the ocean and evolved into whales, if you can believe that. And so they say that's why they have these vestigial bones at the posterior of their body, and they're not useful. This is for when they were cow-like creatures and they used to walk around on land. This is their former leg bones. Well, we've come to find out that these are actually part of the reproductive system of whales, and they are needed. So they are not vestigial. So, what should you ask your teacher about vestigial organs? If vestigial organs demonstrate macroevolution, then what new genes have been added to the animal's genome? Vestigial organs prove the exact opposite. They prove devolution. They prove these animals are devolving. They're losing characteristics. They're losing traits. They're losing genes. So the last take-home point tonight, vestigial organs, number one, are not vestigial. And number two, they prove nothing regarding evolution. Now, we began tonight with a quote from an evolutionary scientist saying that deceit is sometimes used by evolutionists. We're going to conclude with another quote. This is from Dr. Henry Lipson. He was the head of the Department of Physics at the University of Manchester. Notice what he says. In fact, evolution became, in a sense, a scientific religion. Almost all scientists have accepted it, and many are prepared to bend their observations to fit with it. So as I've said to a number of you, and maybe I've said from the pulpit, some of you young folks and children, you may not remember all these points. But just remember, there are answers. There are responses out there. You don't just have to accept these lies because someone is in a position of authority or because someone has a doctorate degree. In fact, the Bible warns us that there will be these false teachers. In 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1, Peter said, "But there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of truth will be blasphemed." I also make the following statement oftentimes when I'm preaching, that I talk to a lot of Christians that are very discouraged at how humanistic and sinful the world and schools are becoming. And I tell them one way to look at it that helps me when I begin growing angry at all the wickedness out there is that if anything, instead of being angry at these people, we should feel sorry for them. One day they will stand before God and give an answer for these lies. The last verse we'll look at, some people have called this the intelligent design verse of the Bible. Romans 1 and verse 20 says, "For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead," notice this, "so that they are without excuse." Don't get angry at these people. You should feel sorry for them. They will have no excuse when they stand before the Lord in judgment. Thank you for your attention tonight. We're going to conclude with the Lord's invitation, inviting anyone who would like to make themselves right with the Lord by confessing their sins and asking for prayers if you're a Christian to do so, or being baptized into Jesus for the remission of your sins. Just to review briefly what we covered on Thursday night, we mentioned Galatians 3:27 that says those who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. Last night we mentioned Acts 2:38, where Peter told them to repent and be baptized for the remission of their sins. Last night we also mentioned that if any of your friends or anyone here tonight believes you're saved by faith only, you're 1,500 years too late. The idea of faith only was popularized around 1500 by reformer Ulrich Zwingli, and if you want to rely on the sinner's prayer, you're about 1,800 years too late, which was popularized, the sinner's prayer, in the late 1800s by evangelical preacher Billy Sunday. Now, the last thing I'll say is that regarding baptism, a lot of people would like to go back to the thief on the cross. The thief on the cross. My children have some of these conversations with their friends and teachers at their homeschool co-op. And so the thief on the cross wasn't baptized, so why should we have to be baptized? I want to make 2 points and then we'll conclude. Number one, we don't know he wasn't baptized. Do we? We don't know that. Many people were going out into the Jordan to be baptized by John the Baptist, a baptism of remission for sins. He already could have been baptized. However, the reason we are told to be baptized is slightly different, even though it's for the remission of sins. I want to look at Romans 6. To me, this is the most powerful evidence for why we cannot be saved like the thief on the cross. Notice Romans 6, 3 through 5. Romans 6, 3, or do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ have been baptized into His what? Into His death. Therefore we have been buried with Him through baptism into death, in order that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have become united with Him in the likeness of His death, we shall also be in the likeness of His resurrection. What's the point there? We are told by the Apostle Paul to be buried in baptism for the remission of sins because it reflects the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Why didn't that apply to the thief on the cross? Because Jesus hadn't died, been buried, or resurrected. But He has today. And we've been told what to do for entrance into the kingdom and have our sins forgiven. If you would like to be baptized into Christ, make your wishes known and come forward as we stand and sing the hymn.